Now, with regard to some of the major structural issues for the hedge funds, here I've listed a number of issues that will need to be discussed, and you'll need to discuss these issues with your hedge fund attorney. A lot of these issues are very basic, straightforward issues, but they do affect the offering documents, which we'll discuss later on. But basically, you're going to need to understand who your investors are, and then for some of the more in-depth issues within the investments, there's a number of different ways that the investments can be made, along with the withdrawals and contribution period. There's just a lot of variables here that you'll discuss with your attorney. There's the fees, the management registration status, which we'll discuss a little bit later on. Reports to investors, selling commission, expenses. These are all issues that you'll discuss with the attorney. And a very important issue, and another one of those hot button issues right now, is the asset valuation practices. Now, if a fund is simple kind of investing in large publicly traded equities, then there's likely to be little valuation issues. But if the fund is going to be investing in more illiquid type securities, then there are going to be more issues with that, and that's one of the things that you'll discuss with your attorney in depth if necessary. Now, one of the many people seem to think that hedge funds are lightly regulated vehicles, but that really is kind of a misnomer. In fact, hedge funds are subject to a number of different laws, both at the state level and at the federal level. What I've kind of laid out here are 5 federal sets of laws that hedge funds are subject to, and then there's other laws as well. We'll start with the Securities Act of 1933, which is a good starting point, as it lays the groundwork for the requirement that all securities are registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Basically, interest in a fund are securities, just like securities that are traded on major exchanges. The only difference is that hedge fund interests aren't registered with the SEC, whereas exchange traded securities almost always are registered with the SEC. There are certain exemptions from the registration provisions at the federal level, and that includes the Regulation D safe harbor, which many hedge funds, almost all hedge funds, use to fall outside of the registration provisions of the 33 Act. With regard to the 34 Act, basically this is the act that regulates broker-dealers, but it also applies to hedge funds if they have 500 investors and $10 million in equity. Then such a fund would need to register under the 1934 Act, which is a little bit different than registration under the 1933 Act. Basically, you'd be a reporting company and have to report certain information to the SEC. Obviously, many funds don't want to do this, and so if a fund would potentially be subject to this, they typically will such a fund would be structured so that they would not fall within this by allowing only 499 investors. Now, with regard to the Investment Company Act of 1940, basically this is the act which requires mutual funds to register with the SEC, and there's very onerous provisions under this act, and a hedge fund normally would fall within the definition of an investment company, but there are certain exemptions that allow hedge funds to not have to comply with many of the provisions of the Investment Company Act, and those exemptions are found in Section 3C1 and Section 3C7 of the Act, and many funds, as you probably know, are termed either 3C1 funds or 3C7 funds. and we will go into the details of those a little bit later on in this presentation. With regard to the Investment Advisors Act of 1940, this is basically the act which requires investment advisors to register with the SEC. It's pretty straightforward. However, there are exemptions from the registration provisions, and those include Section 203(b)(3), which many hedge funds use to escape registration at the federal level, and that exemption allows advisors to remain unregistered if they have less than 15 clients over a 12-month period, and the hedge fund itself counts as the client as opposed to the investors in the fund counting as clients. And this is, if you remember a few years ago the SEC tried to make hedge fund managers register as investment advisors. They did that by changing the rule underneath Section 203(b)(3). Philip Goldstein of Bulldog Advisors actually, as you most likely know, successfully challenged the SEC's authority to do that and won. And this exemption is still available for many hedge fund managers. Whether or not it will continue to be available is up in the air. There are some bills in Congress right now which would potentially require hedge fund managers in certain circumstances to register as investment advisors if they aren't already so registered. With regard to the Commodities Exchange Act, this act basically regulates the trading of commodities and futures, and if a fund is trading commodities and futures, then there will need to be potentially some CPO and CTA registration, and there are some exemptions from the registration as well. Additionally, there are some potential new Forex rules which will be passed under the Commodities Exchange Act. So if you're a Forex manager or manage a Forex fund, then potentially in the future you're going to need to register with the CFTC. And again, I covered that extensively on my blog, and keep up to date on that as well. Now, there are other laws that apply to hedge fund managers as well, including the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, which governs the manner in which hedge funds are taxed. And then there are also what are called blue sky laws, and basically these are the state securities laws. And these state securities laws are just something to be aware of in certain situations. And it's one of those things that you'll discuss with your lawyer. Moving now on to Regulation D. As we discussed before, Regulation D provides an exemption from the securities registration provisions of the 1933 Act. In Regulation D, the most widely used part of the rule of the exemption is Rule 506, and I would say a vast majority of hedge funds use this exemption. Under this exemption, there's no limit on the amount of sales, so you can sell $100 million worth of your hedge fund interest, $200 million, $1 billion, whatever. There is no limit on the amount of money that you can take into the fund. Generally, under Rule 506, the hedge fund can only sell to accredited investors, and I'll define that here shortly. You can also have up to 35 non-accredited investors. However, we generally advise managers not to include non-accredited investors, but under some certain circumstances, it is allowed. It's another one of those issues you'll want to discuss with your attorney. Next, we have the definition of accredited investor, and there are many ways an investor can be an accredited investor. For individuals, there's generally two ways. First, you can have a $1 million net worth, and that does include